Everyone laughed when Jessica said she would marry a security guard. Her friends burst into giggles over lunch. Neighbors whispered that she'd lost her mind, and even her relatives shook their heads in disbelief. How can a nurse, educated and beautiful, choose a man who stands at the hospital gate all night holding a flashlight? They asked. Yet Jessica didn't flinch. She had spent her whole life walking through people's laughter, learning to keep her head high when others looked down. She grew up in the narrow lanes of East London, in a small brick house that always smelled of fresh pastry and hard work. Her father, Richard Thompson, had been a bus driver with big dreams, but an accident stole him away when she was 10. From that day, her mother, Margaret, became both parents in one. Every morning, Margaret would knead dough before sunrise and carry baskets of bread to the market. Jessica and her younger siblings, Lily and Sam, helped stack jars and deliver small orders to neighbors. They were poor, yes, but the house never lacked laughter or faith. One night, while the family ate bread and jam by candlelight, Margaret said something Jessica never forgot. My child, people will always look at what's in your hand before they see what's in your heart. Promise me you'll never make that mistake. Jessica nodded, not realizing that one day that promise would define her entire life. Years later, after finishing nursing school through scholarships and odd jobs, Jessica joined St. Mary's Hospital. Their work was grueling, 12-hour shifts, emergency calls, and endless paperwork. But she treated every patient as family. She held the hands of dying strangers, comforted mothers, and smiled even when her feet ached. Her colleagues called her the gentle nurse, though most had no idea of the storms she fought quietly each night. She was saving every penny to send Lily to college and pay for her mother's heart medicine. Now, before we go any further, take a deep breath, maybe pour yourself a cup of tea, and settle in. Because what you're about to hear isn't just another romance. It's a journey through dignity, patience, and the quiet power of goodness. You're going to see how one act of kindness can change the course of a life, and how laughter can one day turn into applause. Ready? Let's begin. It was on one rainy November evening that Jessica first noticed William Harris. He stood at the hospital's main entrance, his raincoat soaked, umbrella tilted slightly against the wind. Most people rushed past him without a glance, but Jessica saw something different, an air of composure that didn't match the rough fabric of his uniform. When she smiled politely while passing, he nodded back with genuine respect, and that tiny exchange stayed with her far longer than she expected. Over the next few weeks, she noticed him often. He greeted ambulance drivers, held the door for elderly patients, and even helped a cleaner lift a heavy trash bin. His politeness wasn't forced, it came naturally. Once during her break, Jessica saw him scribbling notes in a small leather-bound notebook. Another time, she caught a glimpse of a polished silver pen clipped neatly to his shirt, far too expensive for the job he held. These small details lodged quietly in her mind. Then came the night the rain returned with vengeance. Jessica's umbrella snapped in the wind as she prepared to head home. She sighed and stepped toward the hospital gate when a calm voice called behind her, "Miss Jessica, wait!" She turned to find William holding his old frayed umbrella. "Please, allow me to walk you to the bus stop. The storm's bad tonight." For a second she hesitated, thinking of what others might say, but his tone carried no arrogance, only kindness. "Thank you," she said softly. They walked together through puddles and wind. When a speeding car splashed water across the pavement, William stepped in front of her, taking the entire spray. "You shouldn't have done that," Jessica laughed. "Rain's nothing," he replied. "At least one of us should stay dry." The warmth in his voice made her smile, even as her heart began to pound. The next evening, Jessica brought an extra cup of hot tea from the cafeteria. "You might need this," she said, handing it to him. William accepted it with quiet gratitude. "You're very kind, Miss Jessica." "Kindness doesn't cost anything," she replied, "except maybe a little sleep." That night, when she returned home, she found her mother waiting by the window. "You're glowing," Margaret teased. "Who brightened your day this time?" Jessica smiled faintly. "No one, Mum. Just a friend." Days turned into weeks, and their short exchanges grew into longer conversations. They talked about faith, family, and life. Once Jessica asked what he read during his shifts. He showed her the notebook. It wasn't a novel, but notes from lectures on ethics and leadership. "I like to learn," he said, "even if the world thinks I'm small." His humility stunned her. "You don't sound small at all," she whispered, but not everyone shared her admiration. In the cafeteria, the younger nurses began whispering. Ruth, a sharp-tongued colleague, snickered. "Our sweet Jessica's aiming low, huh? Madam Security coming through." Laughter echoed, but Jessica pretended not to hear. Later that day, she caught Ruth whispering to another doctor, and though she couldn't make out the words, the quick glances told her enough. The gossip had begun. Meanwhile, Rosa, the cleaner who had worked there for years, noticed the mockery. "Don't let them break your spirit, love," she whispered one night. "Good hearts always get mocked before they get rewarded." Jessica smiled gratefully. "Thanks, Rosa, I'll remember that." When Aunt Evelyn visited one weekend, she wasted no time expressing her disapproval. "Jessica, I heard a ridiculous rumor. Tell me you're not seeing that God." Jessica set the kettle down calmly. "I am, Aunt Evelyn. He's a good man." Evelyn scoffed. "Good? He's a nobody. You could marry a doctor, a banker, anyone. Why throw your future away?" "Because I'd rather have peace than pretense," Jessica replied quietly. Evelyn rose angrily. "Peace doesn't pay bills." She shouted and stormed out, slamming the door so hard that the window rattled. Jessica sat beside her mother afterward, her heart heavy. "Maybe I'm wrong, Mum," she murmured. "Maybe people like me shouldn't dream differently." Margaret took her hand gently. "No, my child, you're not wrong. The world just hasn't learned how to see clearly yet." That night, Jessica stood by her bedroom window watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. Somewhere in the darkness, William was standing guard in that same rain. She didn't know why she believed in him so deeply, but something inside told her that fate was preparing her for a story the world would one day remember. The weeks that followed brought a coldness Jessica hadn't expected. At the hospital, the whispers hardened into deliberate jabs. A patient's relative would pretend not to recognize her. A supplier would forget to hand over a small delivery, and Ruth made sure her barbs were heard in the staff room. Jessica bent her head and carried on, but the petty cruelty gathered like frost, small, sharp, and invasive. Each night she lay awake replaying faces and wondering how a tiny kindness could stir so much contempt. Aunt Evelyn began to act instead of only speak. She called a distant cousin, Edward Collins, a successful pharmacy owner, and arranged a luncheon for Jessica's good. She painted the opportunity as concern and pressed Jessica to meet Edward, promising a comfortable future. Evelyn's words were honeyed, but her intent was to humiliate Jessica publicly, place her in a room full of genteel people and let her awkwardness be the spectacle. Jessica refused firmly, and Evelyn's smile became thin and dangerous. Ruth moved from mockery to strategy. She took a photo of Jessica handing William a cup of tea and blurred it into a collage that suggested favoritism, then showed it to a sympathetic junior doctor with the caption, "See how our nurse wastes time with security staff." The doctor, already swayed by gossip, forwarded it. Within days, an anonymous note landed on Jessica's supervisor's desk, accusing her of neglecting duty for personal interest. The allegation had no proof, but it was written to look official. The first real storm had arrived. At the same time, the hospital prepared for a high-profile charity launch, an event with donors, cameras, and prestige. Ruth whispered to event staff that Jessica might cause a scene and nudged a junior coordinator to assign her menial tasks. That night, under polished chandeliers, a staged problem occurred. Vital donor schedules were misplaced, forcing the organizer to publicly scold the nursing staff. Dr. Simmons hinted at unprofessionalism in front of guests, casting a shadow on Jessica's reputation. She stood small and silent as suspicions circled like vultures. Rosa, the cleaner, refused to watch quietly. She confronted Ruth in a narrow hallway, her voice steady but low. "You're playing with someone's life for gossip." Ruth sneered and accused Rosa of being biased. Rosa kept her dignity. Later, she gathered witness statements from porters and a deliveryman who had seen Jessica at her post all evening. Her small courage would become crucial evidence later, but in the moment it felt like one woman speaking against a tide of staged calamity. Back home, Aunt Evelyn escalated privately. She spread a false rumor in the neighborhood that Jessica had accepted expensive gifts from a stranger, an insinuation meant to humiliate and provoke the landlord into eviction pressure. The rumor surged through families and social circles, and soon a landlord hinted he might increase rent if associations continued. The financial strain was sudden. Margaret's medicines were delayed, and Jessica found herself juggling explanations instead of rest. The sabotage had teeth now. It threatened the family's roof. The hospital administration, pressured by donors to preserve image, called Jessica in for a meeting to discuss the anonymous note. The investigator, a polished woman in a grey suit, asked routine questions that felt like interrogation. Jessica answered calmly and provided timesheets, proving her presence during the alleged neglect. Still, an administrative warning letter arrived in her locker the next day. An anonymous complaint had forced their hand. The letter was a sting. It didn't fire her, but it cast a shadow of impropriety over her file. One evening, Jessica found a cold envelope on her doorstep containing photocopied pages of fabricated text messages, suggestive lines taken out of context and arranged to imply an improper relationship. Her hands trembled as she read, but she recognized the clumsy edit. Ruth had tried to manufacture scandal. Jessica went to Rosa and a sympathetic junior nurse, Claire, and asked for help. Claire, who had once been too shy to speak, now stood up and vouched for Jessica's character publicly to a small circle of staff, breaking the quiet conspiracy that had grown in the wings. William's absences increased during this time, and the gaps in his presence unnerved Jessica. He would disappear for days without telling her and return with a tired, guarded face. People noticed, and the rumor mill smelled an opportunity, jealousy, abandonment, failure. Rumors spun that he had left her after the scandal, and some cruel messages were pinned to staff notice boards. Jessica felt an old, familiar loneliness creep back, but rather than fold, she doubled down on care, tending to patients, arranging for Margaret's prescriptions, and refusing to be defined by rumor. To worsen matters, a local blogger picked up the cafeteria gossip and posted a sensationalized piece about a love scandal at St. Mary's. The post included the doctored photo Ruth created and embellished details to attract clicks. Phones buzzed, donors asked questions, a minor sponsor threatened to pull funding. The hospital pressure rose, and the administration hinted that anyone involved in unbecoming conduct would face consequences. It was the first time Jessica wondered if standing by a humble man would cost her career. Then the crisis peaked. During a busy night, a confused elderly patient wandered from the ward and was briefly unaccounted for. Panic shivered through the hospital, and fingers reached for blame. Ruth, with a carefully timed witness statement, suggested that the nursing team had been distracted. The media sniffed scandal. An emergency review was called, and Jessica was placed on provisional suspension pending investigation. The official line claimed it was temporary. The human cost was humiliation, and the suspension letter was a blow designed to make her doubt herself. In those long days on unpaid leave, Aunt Evelyn feigned concern and offered to help by finding legal assistance through a friend, who was actually a man Evelyn had bribed to lean on the investigator. Jessica refused the patronizing aid and instead met quietly with Claire and Rosa. They rallied signatures from staff who'd seen her at her post that night, recollections of William's steady assistance, and copies of CCTV that showed the patient's brief walk. The evidence slowly pieced together like a mosaic that contradicted the manufactured narrative. While the hospital bureaucracy moved slowly, William reappeared in unexpected ways, quiet visits from a distance. An envelope of money slipped under the door marked for Margaret's medicines, and messages of encouragement left with Rosa. He still avoided long conversations about the future. Jessica confronted him one rainy afternoon in the hospital corridor. He looked at her and said simply, "I'm doing what I must. Don't let them use your life as entertainment." The lack of explanation wounded her, but his actions sheltered her family. His secrecy, however, deepened the rumors and gave the conspirators more fuel. As the investigation gathered steam, a surprise witness came forward, a delivery driver who'd been instructed by Ruth to hold a cancelled invoice. He admitted in writing that the invoice had been misdirected to create a false staffing gap that night. The hospital quietly reopened the inquiry. Board members demanded answers about how so many threads of misinformation had been allowed to spread. For a moment the tide seemed to turn, and Ruth's smile flickered with anxiety. Even so, the personal costs remained severe. Neighbors avoided conversation. The landlord hinted again about rent, and Margaret's sleep worsened under stress. Jessica sat nights charting patient vitals in her head to keep from thinking about her own life. She wrote a short letter to the hospital board, detailing her record and attaching testimony from Claire and Rosa. The act of writing steadied her. She felt less like a victim and more like a woman assembling proof of the life she'd always lived. In the quiet between storms, small kindnesses broke through the noise. A regular patient, Mrs. Aldridge, sent a bouquet after learning Jessica had been suspended. With a note, "We know the truth." A junior doctor who had once listened to gossip now visited Jessica at home to apologize and offer to testify. These small reversals felt like oxygen. Slowly, the evidence piled up against the orchestrated smear, and the hospital board agreed to a confidential review that would clear Jessica if the documents confirmed her account. But the conspirators were not finished. Evelyn, furious that her plan to embarrass Jessica publicly had stalled, moved to private attacks, calling the landlord's creditors, arranging for an anonymous complaint to social services, claiming financial neglect. The cruelty here crossed a line into potential legal peril. The social worker's visit rattled Jessica, but Claire and Rosa met the worker with invoices and prescription records, proving the family's care. The visit concluded with an apology for the intrusion, and the social worker left shaking his head at how easily malice could mobilize formal channels. Through it all, Jessica's resolve hardened. She spent days gathering documents, nights listening to her mother's labored breath, and afternoons comforting patients who had no idea of the battle behind the curtains. Her dignity became an instrument, not a shield. She used it to demand fair process rather than to plead for pity. When the hospital finally cleared her name in a formal meeting, the announcement was careful and bureaucratic. But for Jessica, it felt like sunlight breaking the clouds. And yet, even with official clearance, the social consequences lingered. Invitations once rescinded were slow to return. Some colleagues avoided her as if scandal might still cling. The battle for reputation was not won by a memo. It would be won in the slow daily work of kindness and visible leadership. William, meanwhile, remained an ambiguous figure, helpful, secretive, loving, and distant, his pattern of absence and return a mystery that both protected and hurt Jessica. At the end of this act, a final, unnerving note arrives, a plain envelope with a single line of typed text: "Stop exposing us, or you will lose what you love." It is anonymous, menacing, and suggests the conspiracy runs deeper than Ruth and Evelyn. Jessica folds the paper carefully and places it in a drawer, more resolved than afraid. The war has escalated beyond gossip. The next moves must be bolder and smarter. Winter thawed into the brittle light of March, and the hospital buzzed with a mixture of relief and cautious gossip after Jessica's clearance. She returned to her shift greeted by small, awkward smiles. Some colleagues offered low apologies, while others kept distant. The administrative memo had restored her record, but whispered suspicions clung like damp. Jessica focused on work, stitching tiny comforts to anxious patients. but a hollow place lingered where trust should have been. She kept the anonymous threat folded in a drawer as a reminder that the fight wasn't over. William's behavior grew even more mysterious. He arrived at odd hours and sometimes left in a chauffeured car that appeared unseen in the staff parking lot. He continued to send money for Margaret's medicines in discreet envelopes and left notes of encouragement through Rosa, but he refused long explanations. When Jessica pressed him gently one night in a deserted corridor, he only smiled and said, "When the time is right, everything will make sense." His calmness steadied her heart and at the same time made colleagues more suspicious. Why would a guard move in and out by car if not for secrets? Small clues had been planted earlier. Now they became impossible to ignore. A visiting trustee spotted William's handwriting on a donation slip in a meeting and paused. A vendor remembered that William had once ordered uniforms with a corporate account number traced to Anderson Holdings, a firm many associated with William Anderson, a businessman often in headlines. In the staff room, Ruth tried to brush off the coincidence with a sarcastic remark, but the seed of curiosity had been planted deeper now. The hospital buzzed with murmurs that this watchman was more than he seemed. Then the evening came when the turning point happened. The hospital hosted a gala to honor community partners, streaming live to local news. William, assigned to security as always, appeared in the back of the ballroom and moved through the crowd with an ease that made people notice. Halfway through the speech, lights dimmed for a surprise presentation. A video montage played, showing a philanthropic foundation's work. The montage ended with an unexpected live feed from a remote office, and William stepped forward as a bewildered Jessica watched, suddenly flanked by aides in suits. The audience gasped. The man they had known at the gate removed his cap and was introduced as William Anderson Harris, heir and managing director of Anderson Holdings. For a moment, time tripped. Jessica felt as if the floor had fallen out from beneath her. Cameras swiveled. Guests murmured. Faces she'd known for years, rearranged into shock and envy. William, his voice steady, walked to the podium and said plainly, "I came back to find someone who loved me when the world couldn't see my face. I found Jessica." He explained succinctly and without flourish that he had taken the assignment as a test, to be loved for who he was before his name, to learn something the boardrooms had never taught him. The reveal landed like thunder. People who had scorned Jessica now stared at her with newly complicated faces. The initial reaction was awe, then awkward repentance, then a harsher current of anger among those who had been humiliated by their earlier cruelty. And Evelyn appeared in the crowd with a face that had hoped for redemption. But now her forced smile thinned. Ruth's smirk dissolved into a look of startled calculation. Media vultures circled, hungry for a human interest angle. Some donors asked blunt questions about hiring and image control, while others whispered praise. For Jessica, the feeling was bewilderment threaded with relief. The vindication tasted like a sudden bright rain after a long drought. But the reveal did not simply end the story. It complicated it. With the world now watching, old conspirators dug into new schemes. A tabloid published an insinuating piece about Jessica playing the long game to marry a rich man, twisting old gossip into dangerous lies. Evelyn, whose pride had been wounded visibly on stage, retreated and began making desperate calls to old acquaintances, hinting at deeper scandals to shore up her pride. Ruth, sensing her influence slipping, circulated another doctored image, this time a photo chosen to imply Jessica had lobbied for Anderson funds before being publicly engaged. The narrative left room for doubt and invited new attacks. William's board faced scrutiny too. Shareholders questioned his methods and asked whether his disguise had jeopardized partnerships. Internal emails leaked alleging conflict of interest. A conservative board member questioned the ethics of testing staff by deception. William calmly defended his choices publicly. He had wanted to discover genuine human values, not stage a spectacle. Yet in the quiet halls, whispers suggested the test had been irresponsible, and that Jessica's reputation was now entangled in a corporate controversy. The vindication had grown thorny. Publicity cut both ways. At home, the family felt the shift in personal ways. Margaret watched the television with trembling hands as her daughter's face filled the screen, and neighbors who had once tutted now called with apologies woven in veiled congratulations. The landlord softened. The local grocer offered a credit line, and some people even asked forgiveness. Yet there were darker calls too. Emails with veiled threats and a few anonymous demands for hush money. The note that had once warned Jessica paled beside the avalanche of attention. Protection remained important, but now had a new dimension: privacy and legal counsel. Inside the hospital, the micro-politics intensified. Claire, once shy and uncertain, took a more public stance, telling colleagues she'd seen William's tireless work and that Jessica had been admirable long before any title. Rosa, who had defended Jessica early on, now found herself in a spotlight she hadn't sought. Reporters wanted her quote. The junior doctor who had once forwarded gossip now appeared contrite and offered testimony to the board about the manufactured nature of the initial smear. These small realignments mattered. They created a social correction, even as the rumor machine spun fresh stories. The turning point also forced William into a new, awkward role: protector and public partner. He wanted to shield Jessica from tabloids and boardroom politics while also being transparent that he never asked her to play any part in his reveal. Jessica's heart was full of conflicting feelings: joy that his identity affirmed her choice, anger that he hadn't trusted her with the truth sooner, and fear that publicity could become yet another battlefield. In the quiet moments of that night, they spoke long and raw, confessing hurt, trust, and the limits of love in a complicated world. Finally, as the day wound down and cameras left for more sensational stories, a small but important victory emerged. Several donors and a community group publicly affirmed their support for Jessica's work at the hospital, denouncing the smear attempts and praising her consistent service. That public support would be a foundation, literal and figurative, on which she could rebuild trust. Still, Jessica tucked away a new fear: that vindication could be fragile when built on spectacle rather than slow, steady life work. The path forward required patience and strategic courage. The morning sun poured through the glass walls of Jessica's new office at the foundation, painting everything in a golden glow that felt almost unreal. Months had passed since that unforgettable night, and her life had transformed beyond anything she could have imagined. She now spent her days visiting hospitals, funding scholarships, and building shelters for children who had no one to care for them. Everywhere she went, people greeted her with respect and admiration, but Jessica never let the praise change her. She still took the bus sometimes, still stopped to talk to the guards at the hospital, and still smiled at strangers who looked lost. Wealth had entered her life, but humility never left her soul. One chilly morning, as she was reviewing files in her office, her assistant entered with a pale face. "Ma'am," she said softly, "there's a woman outside asking to see you." "She says she's your relative." Jessica frowned slightly. "Send her in." When the door opened, Jessica froze. It was Aunt Evelyn. The same woman who had once mocked her for loving a poor man now stood before her, looking tired, aged, and broken. "Jessica," she began, her voice trembling, "I know I don't deserve to be here. I lost everything. My business collapsed, and I have nowhere else to go." For a long moment, Jessica said nothing. The room felt painfully silent, except for the ticking clock on the wall. Finally, Jessica stood and walked toward her aunt. The same people who once humiliated her were now at her mercy. But instead of anger, Jessica felt something unexpected: compassion. "Sit down, Aunt Evelyn," she said gently. "You don't need to explain. Sometimes life teaches us lessons the hard way." Evelyn lowered her head in shame as tears rolled down her cheeks. "I treated you horribly. You were kind and I made you feel small." Jessica handed her a cup of tea. "What matters is that you learned," she said. "I forgave you a long time ago." William arrived a few minutes later, and when he saw Evelyn, he immediately understood. Without hesitation, he offered her a place to stay until she got back on her feet. Evelyn wept, unable to comprehend how the two people she had ridiculed were now the ones saving her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked through tears. Jessica smiled softly. "Because if I respond to hate with hate, the story never changes. But if I respond with love, maybe the next person will think twice before judging someone." Weeks turned into months, and slowly, Evelyn found a new path. She began volunteering at the foundation, helping children with their education. One day, while sorting books in the library, she whispered to Jessica, "You were right. Real wealth isn't money, it's peace." Jessica hugged her gently. "That's the only kind of wealth worth keeping," she replied. Years later, Jessica and William stood together at a charity gala celebrating the foundation's 5th anniversary. The hall was filled with laughter, music, and the faces of those whose lives had changed because of their work. As William gave his speech, he turned to the audience and said, "I once met a woman who looked beyond the surface of the world and saw the heart of it. She taught me that love without pride, kindness without expectation, and forgiveness without condition can change everything." The crowd rose in applause as he looked at Jessica with eyes full of pride and affection. When the night ended and the guests had gone, Jessica and William stepped outside under the soft glow of the city lights. "It feels like a dream, doesn't it?" she said quietly. "No," he replied. "It feels like destiny." She smiled and leaned into him, her heart full. "Do you think people will remember our story?" she asked. William took her hand and said, "If they do, I hope they remember it not because of the mansion or the money, but because two people refused to give up on love when it was hardest to believe." And as the night wind danced through the air, Jessica realized that her journey had come full circle, from ridicule to respect, from pain to peace. Life had tested her in every way, but she had emerged not just victorious, but wiser. Her love story wasn't about wealth or status, it was about grace. It was proof that sometimes the world laughs when it doesn't understand your path, but in the end, those who walk with love always have the last smile. Months had passed since the hospital wing's inauguration, and life had finally slowed into something that resembled peace. Jessica now walked through St. Mary's, not as the nurse who once faced humiliation, but as a respected leader. Her presence brought calm to tense wards, her words carried weight, and her laughter returned warmth to a place that had once turned cold. People no longer whispered when she passed. They greeted her with gratitude, respect, and a quiet kind of awe. Margaret, her mother, often sat by the window of their new home, tending to small pots of jasmine. The house was modest, despite their fortune, a reflection of Jessica's heart. She had insisted they keep their lives simple, closer to the people who once stood beside them in hard times. Sometimes she'd say softly, "Money changes nothing if kindness doesn't grow with it." Those words became the quiet anthem of their new beginning. William, too, transformed. His company thrived, but he spent most of his time visiting hospitals and community centers rather than boardrooms. He often joked, "You cured my ego faster than any doctor could." The two shared not just love, but a purpose, to heal more lives than they could ever count. Together they turned their experiences into something bigger, hope made practical through service. Rosa, now promoted to staff coordinator, often recalled how the world had once mocked Jessica. They laughed because they didn't understand strength, she'd tell new hires. But the same laughter turned into applause when truth revealed itself. The Yasser Hospital even started a yearly award in roses, named for integrity among support staff, a symbol that quiet loyalty never goes unnoticed. Even Aunt Evelyn's story found its own quiet ending. After public disgrace, she left London and moved to a small coastal town, where she lived alone for some time. One afternoon, a letter arrived at Jessica's office. It was from Evelyn, her handwriting trembling with regret. She wrote, "I see now that envy rots the soul faster than poverty. Thank you for forgiving me before I forgave myself." Jessica smiled sadly, folded the letter, and prayed that her aunt had finally found the peace she had long chased in the wrong direction. As for Ruth, she disappeared from the city's gossip for years. But one day, Jessica received a volunteer application for the Thompson Foundation, signed Ruth Collins. Attached was a short note. "We all need a second chance. Thank you for showing me what one looks like." Jessica accepted it without hesitation, proving that grace isn't weakness, it's strength in its highest form. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale, but something far more meaningful, a rhythm of normal days made sacred by gratitude. Jessica continued to work in the very place where she had once been ridiculed. Her name no longer sparked rumors, only respect. Every evening, as she closed the office, she'd look at her mother's photo on the wall and whisper, "We made it, Mum, and we did it without losing ourselves." As time went on, journalists occasionally revisited her story. Some called it a modern Cinderella tale, but Jessica always corrected them gently. "No, it's not a Cinderella story. It's a story about remembering that dust on a crown and dust on a shoe are made of the same earth." Her humility became her signature, her story a reminder that dignity outlasts deception, and truth always finds a way to shine even in the darkest corridors. And so, the girl once mocked for loving a security guard became a living testament to patience, honesty, and unshakable faith in good. She didn't rise because she sought power. She rose because she refused to lose her heart while the world tried to break it. Her journey closed not with applause, but with quiet contentment, a peace earned through struggle and softened by forgiveness.